Okay, so we left it last week in Gemarah Sanhedrin. We're on page 5b. We left it last week with a question as to why Rav was not given permission by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, why he was not given permission to paskin shilas of the animals of the Bechorot. Remember, there were three types of smicha, if you like. There was yoreh, which is the smicha which we have, sort of smicha that we have today, where a rabbi is given authority to answer questions of what's called heter and isur, things that are permitted and things that are forbidden, so kashrut, things of Shabbat, things of halacha. Then there is yadin, which is the what today the dayanim, somebody who is a dayan has the qualification of yadin, and that is the qualification to deal with monetary cases according to halacha. And then, there's the final one, which is yatir, and this was to do with the animals, which were firstborn animals, which had to go to the Beit Hamikdash and had to be given as an offering. However, if they developed a blemish of a certain type, a permanent blemish of a certain type called a mum, then it could then be redeemed and didn't go to the Beit HaMikdash, and it could be used. Now, yatir, it was somebody who was qualified to look at an animal and say, yes, this is a blemish which is permanent and therefore disqualifies the animal as a korban, as a sacrifice, and we can then use it. Or, no, this is only a temporary blemish, and if you give it some penicillin, it'll get better, and then it will be able to go to the Beit HaMikdash, and therefore you can't use it. And that was called Yatir Bechorot. Now, remember, Rabbi Chia had two nephews. We spoke about why one was called his brother's son and one was called his sister's son. The first nephew, Rav Chana, was given permission to do all three. Rabbi said, yes, you can have Yoreh, Yodin, Yatir. Came to Rav, who, by all accounts, was the greater scholar of the two, and he was only given permission for Yoreh and Yodin. He was not given the permission for Yatir, which meant he could not paskin shilas of the animals. And we asked the question at the end of last week's shiur, or 2 weeks ago, because we weren't here last week. We asked the question, why was it that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi did not give Rav permission to do the animals questions, to answer the animal questions? And we said that one suggestion was that he didn't know anything about animals. That wasn't his field of expertise. And we kicked that out because we found out that actually Rav had spent 18 months living with the herdsman exactly for this purpose, to learn how to paskin these shilas. So it can't be that he didn't know enough. And so that was where we got to, really. We didn't have an answer as to why Rabbi did not give Rav permission to paskin these shilas. So we're going to carry on in the Gemarah now. I'm going to share the screen with you. If I can find it. There it is. Can you all see the screen? Yeah, good. Okay. So, here we are. So, this is where we got to. Yatir Bechorot. The Gemarah had related that Rabbi Chia had asked Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, can he, Rav, paskin the shilas of Bechorot? Al Yatir. No, he's not allowed. That was what Rabbi said. My tama, why? Ilema mishum de lo chakim. If you're going to tell me that he's not clever enough, haka amrinam de chakim tuva. This is what we did at the end of last week. We know that he's clever because that's the whole reason why we called him his sister's son. Remember, there was that pasuk in Mishlei which said, Chachma should be around you like a sister. And so when he referred to Rav as his sister's son, that was implying how clever he was. So we know he's very clever. So it's not because he's not clever enough. Ella mishum delo bakia b'mumei. So it must be, like we said before, because he doesn't know enough about these blemishes, and he's not an expert in this field. But then the Gemarah says, "Well, I'm a Rav, but Rav has told us, Shmona Asa Chodashim Gidalti Eitzel Roa Behema Leida Eza Mum Kavua Be'eza Mum Over." I spent 18 months doing a stage here in this field. So it wasn't because. It can't be because he didn't know enough about these animals. So we came to the conclusion at the end of the last shiur that it was to give kavod to Rabbi Bar Chana because he wasn't as well known and wasn't as likely to get people coming to ask him questions as Rav. And so in order to give him a bit of extra kavod and to give him one up on Rav, he was the only one that was given that permission. Okay, so that's where we got to last time. So this is now new stuff. The Gemarah doesn't really like that answer. When it says ve'i bait ema, which is what we're going to say now, which is translated here as if you wish to say instead, it's an indication that what they just said doesn't really, what's the expression, cut the mustard. It's not really a great answer, so we're trying again. So v'iba mitema, okay, we've got a different approach here. Mishum ha gufei, to Rav Bakia mumeit fei. It's not because Rav doesn't know enough about blemishes, he knows too much. How can that possibly be? So the Gemarah says that somebody who knows too much can't answer questions. That sounds a little bit paradoxical to me, and it's certainly counterintuitive. How can it be that he would know too much? So listen to this for a bit of twisted Gemarah logic here. V'sharei mumei de lo yodi enoshe. He would permit blemishes that nobody else would permit, right? Everybody else would say, no, that's not a blemish that we can permit. And because he's such an expert, he would recognize that this is a blemish that you can permit. And so then what will happen, after Rav leaves the area and he goes off back to Israel, let's say, remember he's going down, the whole point of this getting permission from Rabbi was because he was leaving the area, he was going to Bavel, and he was going to paskin shilas there. So when he moves on, either permanently or goes to a different place, Amru, people will say, Ki hai gavna shra Rav. Here's a blemish. When this blemish was shown to Rav when he was here, he permitted it. And because they are not as well versed in blemishes as Rav, they will mistake something that Rav permitted and will permit something which they should not have permitted. In other words, if Rav, because Rav is so experienced in this field, that he's going to lead people astray, because people are going to look at something and think that if Rav was here, he would have permitted that, because that's what they saw last time. And they would not have understood that there is a nuance here. There is something slightly different about this one in front of us to the one that Rav did back in the day. So because Rav is so clever, Rebbe was frightened that he would paskin shilas and cause trouble for people later on. It's a bit like I explained a couple of weeks ago, that when I used to ask my rabbi kashrus questions, he'd say it's perfectly all right, but don't tell your wife, just go and kasher it anyway, because he was worried that next time, either we won't ask the question because we'll think it's okay, and there might be something slightly subtly different about that case. So because Rav was so clever on these particular cases, they were worried that that would happen. Okay, so the Gemarah seems to be accepting of that, because that's the end of that little subject about Rav's failure to obtain the yatir. Julia's not happy. She's got a
isn't asking your question to Rabbi from King's Road about a cut different than asking about the blemishes for an animal, though?
Well, the principle's the same. The principle is that you've got to ask shaylas, and that's the bit where we're coming up to next, actually.
But Rabbi Gilbert would know immediately about the cup and the knife or whatever it was that you would in doubt about, but he may not know about the animal, though.
No, the principle is the same. And what I meant to say was this, that if I've got, okay, I'm not a good example now because I've got me, but you, for example, right? You've got a shilah. Something happens in your kitchen, right? You think you've traced up a knife. This is the bit we're going to do actually in the Gemarah in a minute. You think you've traced up a knife, right? The point is you have to ask a shilah of a rabbi, of your rabbi. You can't take that on your own and paskin that shilah. Why? Because you might think that you know the answer, but there might be some subtle thing that you don't know about here. That's another part of kashrus that you haven't learnt, that you can't paskin for yourself. So there was very often a case where I had a kashrus shilah, which I thought I knew the answer to, but I would never take it upon myself to paskin that shilah. I would always go to the rabbi.
Yeah.
More often than not, I was right, what I'd originally thought. But sometimes I was wrong, and I was wrong because there was a certain fact that I hadn't taken into account, because I hadn't learnt it properly, because I hadn't been tested on it properly, etc. So the principle is the same. What would happen is if Rav would be allowed to paskin these animals, he would give an answer on a certain animal, and then he's not there to ask anymore. Somebody who had an animal with a similar blemish would say, oh, well, that's very similar to the one that he had, so I'll paskin it for myself and say that it was okay. Are you with me?
Yeah.
So that's the sort of principle. Okay, Julia, you don't look happy. Unmute yourself, please. We can't hear you. There we go.
I think all three are unsatisfactory answers, and rather than say why, I just wondered, is there a payment to the person who makes the decision? I mean, it seems a very unfair decision. Do they get paid for acting as judges in this capacity?
I would imagine that they would, yes, because that would be their paranosa. I imagine they would, and I suspect that if we go back to the previous answer, that's why they wanted to give kavod to Rabbi Bar Chana, because they were worried that he wouldn't have any paranosa, because everybody would go to Rav for their questions. So I think that's possibly why they did that. So I think the answer to your question is probably yes.
I remember
I find they're all unsatisfactory. I mean, the second one about making sure the other rabbi had people come to him, it's like when you bring up children, you don't bring up children like that to condemn one to the advantage of another. It's inappropriate. And as for the fact that he may know too much, but wouldn't it have been a good thing for him to have been teaching and letting other people have the benefit of his knowledge rather than just upping sticks and going back to Israel. It doesn't seem very satisfactory. There's no way, of course, of knowing what the real reason was.
I agree with you that the last reason is unsatisfactory. I'm not sure I entirely agree with you about the previous reason, which is Rabbi Baruch Hannah's position. If you were to have two children, one of whom is a superstar and the other one is not, would it not be a reasonable thing to have find something that the one who's not a superstar is very good at, and to build his confidence up and build his position up by giving him that particular? For example, I'll give you an example.
No.
I'll give you an example. You might have two pupils in a class, or you might have two children, or even two grandchildren. One of whom's academic, and the other one is not. Okay, and the one who is not is very good with his hands. Right, so you get a woodwork teacher so that he can make something beautiful, which the academic one wouldn't have a clue with. So
absolutely, that is absolutely correct, but that is not the situation here. What you're doing is taking something that somebody is good at and depriving him of the opportunity to use it. If it was a different area where the second rabbi was better, then that would be a different situation. I don't think it is good.
Okay, but remember, he's not had all three taken off him. He's still got the two.
His living is reduced because, as you say, they're getting paid, and he's not getting paid for this. I don't know. I mean, we don't know what the answer is.
No, we don't really know. But I mean, in that situation, they both turn up. Let's say they both turn up in the same town. Rabbi Baruch Hannah is known as the animal expert, so the animal shilas go to him. Rav is known as the monetary expert, so the monetary cases go to him. And they remember they're cousins. Yeah, they're cousins, these two. Yeah, I agree with you. I'm only really arguing as devil's advocate here, because I agree. I don't think the answers are particularly satisfactory.
I took a chicken to Dan Steinberg once. I can't remember the circumstances, and it didn't charge me.
Right, there you go. Yeah, but
and it wasn't my role.
No, but he was paid by the Chasike Adas to be the diet. Yeah. Okay, let's move on, because we're going to get something interesting now.
Last one.
So let's carry on. Now, we're going to talk about, we've got a question here by the Gemarah, exactly the kind of question that we just referred to, actually. Yora. We know that when both Rav and Rabbi Baruch Hannah went to Rabbi, or Rabbi Chia went on their behalf to Rabbi, and he asked the question, Yora, are they allowed to answer questions of permitted and not permitted things? And he said, yes, they are. Igamer, says the Gemarah. Igamer, if he has studied, the same word as Gemarah, okay? Igamer, if he's studied and he's a knowledgeable person, right? Reshuta lamali lemishkal. Why does he need to get permission? If everybody knows he's a clever guy and he's learned lots of things, why did he need to go and get the title rabbi? Why did he need to get that title before he went? There are plenty of people who we know who are very, very learned, very, very clever, very, very knowledgeable about halakha, and don't have the title of rabbi, and they would know the answers to the questions. So why did he why did he feel the need to obtain permission from Rabbi, in other words, to obtain smicha, to get the title rabbi? Was it not the fact that his knowledge was good enough, whether he had the title or not? That's the question that we've got. And it applies to what we've just been talking about, because let's take the kashrus shaila. I used to think that I knew enough about kashrus that was wrong, actually. But I used to think that I knew enough about kashrus to answer a simple question that arose in my own kitchen. So why didn't I just ask myself, or ask my next door neighbor, or why did I have to go to the rabbi, somebody who has the title rabbi? So the Gemarah tells us this is why. It's going to answer now. Mishum ma'aseh shahaya. Because of a story, an incident that took place once. Okay, Titania. We learned in the Braita, Pam achat, once, halach Rabbi, I'll say the very same Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Rabbi went, lemakom echad, he went to this place, doesn't say where it is, v'ra'ah, and he saw bnei Adam, people, shemegablin isotehem betum'ah. Okay, so what did he see? He saw people there making their bread, kneading their dough in a vessel, in a bowl, which was tamei. It was impure. Okay, so we have to stop here and do a little bit of background, understanding a little bit about the laws of Tumah and Tahara. It's important that we do this. So we know the concept of purity and impurity. If you come into contact with a dead body or or something which transmits this idea of Tumah, of impurity, then a person or a vessel can become impure, tamei. Now there are certain things which are not allowed to become tamei. For example, holy food from a korban, a sacrifice that was brought to the temple, that has to be eaten. That's called kochim. It's called holy food. It can't be eaten by somebody who is tamei, and it can't become tamei itself by being in contact with something which is impure. Now, regular food, ordinary food, which is not holy food, it's not either a korban, or it's not truma, which is given to the kohen, or maaser, which is given to the Levi, which has to be eaten in a state of purity. Regular food, ordinary bread that you would make, you are allowed to eat it if it's tamei. It's allowed to come into contact with tamei things. It doesn't make it inedible. Only holy foods become inedible if they become tamei. So the first question we've got on this Gemarah is, we're going to see in a second that Rabbi is going to tell them off for doing this, for kneading their dough in an impure vessel. But actually, al pi halacha, there's nothing wrong with that. Only all the commentators ask this question: why is Rabbi getting his knickers in the twist about this? Because actually, it's perfectly permitted what they were doing. But it turns out that this place, where we're not told where it is, we're just told it's makom echad, one place, a particular place. This particular place had the strong custom not to make bread in an impure vessel. In other words, they had taken on a chumrah, a stringency, a bit like Manchester. Right, we've had this whole discussion before. When does the Mars bar become kosher again? When you leave Manchester and go towards London, at what point on the journey does the Mars bar that the London Beth Din says is kosher and the Manchester Beth Din says isn't? At what point does it become kosher? So the reason that Manchester say it's not kosher and London say it is because Manchester takes a more stringent view. It has the custom to be stringent, more stringent about chalav akum, meaning non-shomed milk. So this place that Rebbe turned up at is a place where he knew, and it was well known, that they had taken on a stringency that they did not knead, with a K, their bread, their dough, in a tamei vessel. And he saw that they were doing that. Now, how does an object become tamei? It has to be in contact with a tamei object. But the food that is in contact with this tamei bowl is only tamei once it has previously come into contact with a liquid. Okay, if it's completely dry goods, it doesn't pass the tumah, the impurity does not pass on. It has to come into contact with one of 7 liquids. Okay, 7 liquids, and that is called the machshir tumah. It prepares it for tumah. Now, what are those 7 liquids? Well, very handily, Rav Steinsaltz tells us over here on the right-hand side of the page, under the title Halacha, he tells us what those 7 liquids are. And they are water, dew, wine, blood, oil, milk, and honey. Okay? All of those things, if they come into contact with a food particle, a food item, that prepares the item to become tamei. It doesn't make it tamei, but then once this food has come into contact with one of those liquids, if it goes into a tamei vessel, the food becomes tamei. Okay? But if it doesn't come into contact with one of those liquids first, and it goes into a tamei vessel, it does not become tamei. So in order for it to transmit or to have its tumah transmitted to it, this dough had to have been in contact, or the flour to be made into dough had to be in contact with one of these 7 liquids. One of the liquids which does not cause the food to be ready to accept tumah is albumin, egg whites, which is known in the Gemarah expression as mei beitzim, the water of eggs. Okay, so the water of eggs is one of the things which does not cause the food to be susceptible to tumah. So that's the background. Okay, now let's go back into the Gemarah and see why Rabbi was getting his knickers in a twist. He goes to this place and he sees these people in a place where he knows that they shouldn't be doing this because it's their minhag not to do it. And he says to them, Amar lahem, mipnei ma atem megablin isotechem betumah. Why are you doing this? Why are you kneading your dough in impure vessels? You shouldn't be doing that. Amrulo, the people of the place said to him, to Rabbi, oh, Talmid echad ba'alakan, one pupil, a pupil from the yeshiva, once turned up in this place. V'horalanu, and he taught us, mei betzaim ein machshirin. Marsh water, mei betzain, is marsh water, does not prepare or does not make the food susceptible to tumah. V'hu mei beitzim darash lahu. What he meant to say, this fellow, was mei beitzim, albumin, water of eggs. But they understood it as mei betzaim. You can see the confusion. The 2 words are very similar. He said, or at least he thought he said, mei beitzim. You're allowed to knead your dough with eggs, or albumin of eggs, and that will not make it susceptible to tumah. But they thought that he'd said marsh water.
How could they possibly think that? How could they possibly think you can use dirty swamp water?
Okay, well, bearing in mind, most of their water wasn't clean anyway. I mean, they take, even today, people go down to the river and they take water, and, not everybody had access to fresh water, even in the 21st century. There are places in Africa that don't have access to fresh water.
What is the Hebrew word for swamp, Johnny?
Well, there is a word, batzah, which means a swamp. It's not a modern Hebrew word. I don't know the Hebrew word for modern Hebrew word for swamp off the top of my head. Maybe Nechama can tell us. I think Nechama's with us somewhere. But certainly in biblical or Gemarah Hebrew anyway. But you can understand the difference. To us, it's daft because eggs and swamps don't sound anything like one another. But Beitzim and Bitsaim are very similar. And if they didn't hear right, or if he didn't speak clearly, they could easily get mixed up. I remember speaking to Herzl, our Herzl, not Theodore Herzl. I never spoke to him. Our Herzl. I remember speaking to him, and he was speaking to me in English, and he said, what did he say? He says, "I've got a terrible death." I didn't have a clue what he was talking about. He says, "I've got a terrible death." I said, "What? What are you talking about?" And of course, what he meant was he'd gone terribly deaf. Right? Now, the word in Hebrew for death, obviously, is mavet, and the word for deaf is cheresh. Right? They're nothing like one another. But when he translated it in his head, he got mixed up, or he didn't say it clearly. I thought it said death, and he meant deaf. So here we've got the same thing. These people thought he said mei b'tsaim, marsh water, and really he said mei beitzim. And they were using, so what they were telling him, what they were telling Rabbi was, don't worry, Rabbi, it's okay. This is marsh water that we've used. And, you know, we're allowed to use marsh water, aren't we? Because Yankel came from the yeshiva a few years ago and told us that that was okay. And actually, Yankel had either not said his words clearly enough or hadn't explained himself clearly enough, hadn't made sure that they had understood clearly enough, and what he had meant to say was mei beitzim and not mei b'tsaim. So, and then there was another example. There was another example. V'ta'unami baha. And there was the same place. These people, and maybe they were all deaf as well, because they also made a mistake here. Another mistake. The same people in the same place made another mistake. Mei kramion umei figa pesulin. Mipnei shehein mei b'tsaim. Okay? It was taught in a Mishnah. This is a Mishnah in Masechet Para that says the waters of the river Kramion and the river Piga are not, are pasulin. They are no good. They don't work. Why? Because they are marsh waters. Now, what's this talking about? This is talking about a completely different subject. It's talking about something we read last Shabbat, and which they will read, you will read, Michael Kraus, this Shabbat in Parshat Chukat, the Para Aduma, the Red Heifer. Now, the Red Heifer, very briefly, is a peculiar law which says somebody who is tamei, somebody who is impure, the way to purify yourself is you have to take the some ashes from a completely burned red cow and mix it with something called mayim chayim, living waters, meaning running water, water from a running source. So it has to be from a stream or a river and not from a lake or a man-made reservoir. It has to be mayim chayim. And you mix those things together and you sprinkle it on the person who's tamei on the third day and the seventh day. He goes into the mikveh after that, and that's the end of his tumah. That's how you do it. That's the process of purifying a person who is a tamei mate. So this Mishnah in Para, what's Para? Para is a cow. This Mishnah, this whole Masechet, is talking about the halachot of the Para Aduma, which we read about on Shabbat, tells us that the waters from these two rivers are not considered Mayim Chayim. They're not considered to be running water, to be living water, literally. Why? Mipnei shehein mei b'tsaim. Because they are marsh water. They're stagnant waters. Now, Marcel, have you had a chance to look up where these places are?
Oh,
these
yes.
rivers?
Yes. All southern Iraq is marshland. There's marsh Arabs who live on islands of reeds.
Okay, well, it may well be.
North of Kuwait.
Okay, so here we go. Rabbi Steinsaltz on the right side of your page here tells us a couple of opinions as to where these places are. Very interesting this, because there's two different opinions. Kramion Ufiga, these are the names of two rivers in Eretz Yisrael that were apparently well known. The Kramion is apparently the Naaman stream that flows near Akko. Okay, so that's Kramion. Even today, its waters are mixed with water from adjacent swamps. Remember, when the first Yishuv came over to Eretz Yisrael at towards the end of the 19th century, what did they find here? Swamps, mosquitoes, malaria, terrible conditions. And by planting lots of eucalyptus trees and working their backs off, they managed to turn the swampland into the beautiful land that we know it today. So even today, this river, the Naaman stream, which is said to be the Kramion, has its waters mixed with the water from adjacent swamps. Interestingly, look at this. The Figa is another name for the Yarkon River. The Yarkon River, which flows close to Tel Aviv, which was once surrounded by swamps. Tel Aviv was at one point swampland. The city of Pagai, present-day Rosh Ha'ayin, which is in the center of the country, was located near its source. And then other experts identify these rivers with Amana and Parpar, two rivers that flow near Damascus, whose waters also mix into swamps. And that would also fit in, both of those actually would fit in with what Rabbi was up to. Because remember, Rabbi traveled around, he could have, and as Marcel said before we actually started recording the shiur, when the rabbis went from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, they didn't go across the desert due east. They went north first and then followed the water sources down into Mesopotamia. So it could well be that Rebbe turned up at these places and at these places where these rivers were mentioned. So these people in this place, this unnamed place, made a mistake. They read this Gemarah, this Mishnah. They read the Mishnah and understood well that the waters from these two rivers were not good enough, were considered pasul as mayim chayim for the para aduma. They understood that. Ve'inu savur, but they then erroneously extrapolated that and said, since they are not considered mayim chayim, then also they don't work as water to make the food susceptible to tamei. So that was a double whammy of a mistake that they made because it's not the case. Velohi, since the waters were pasul for this para aduma, they also thought that it wasn't considered water at all. It only wasn't considered mayim chayim. It wasn't considered flowing water. It wasn't considered living water. But if you go back up to here, our halacha that Rabbi Steinsaltz very kindly puts here, it doesn't say flowing water is one of the 7 liquids which make food susceptible to tamei. It says water. And they erroneously extrapolated from one halacha to another. And because of these two mistakes that were made, then the halacha is that you can't paskin shilas until you have smicha. Now, what does smicha tell you? It tells you, first of all, this is what it should tell you anyway. It tells you that you know your stuff. Now, this Talmud that came here, this Talmud that came over here and taught them about the egg water, and he was misunderstood. He knew his stuff. So what's this got to do with the price of cheese? In other words, how does it help that you've got smicha? And Rashi explains this to us. Rashi makes a big, long performance of this, because Rashi says that part of the smicha process back in the day, when you went to your Rabbi, or you went to whoever it was that you were going to for smicha, they tested you not only on your knowledge, but whether you were able to speak clearly and whether you had an ability to transmit the knowledge that you have to somebody else. So, I mean, I'm sure we've all had teachers, whether they be teachers of secular or religious subjects, who were very knowledgeable about their subjects, but were hopeless teachers. You can't understand a word they said, either because they didn't speak clearly enough, or because they didn't speak at the level of their pupils. They were too highfalutin. We've all seen it. I certainly had teachers who were very knowledgeable, but did not have teaching skills. And so part of the smicha test, if you like, was to establish whether you were able to pass over your knowledge in a correct way. Remember, this was all orally passed down at this stage. If there was, even after the time of the Mishnah, there weren't very many copies of the Mishnah. They would have to be written down by hand. It was long before the printing press was invented. If there was one copy of the Mishnayos in a whole place, in a whole city of hundreds of thousands of people, you'd be lucky. So everything was passed down ba'al peh. That is why, it's still to this very day in the Haredi world, there is a very, very strong emphasis on learning things off by heart. I remember as a kid being entered into the Mishnayos Baal Peh competition, to how many Mishnayos you could recite by heart. I never won. I could manage usually 10 or 20, and there'd be some guy there that could do 150, 200 off by heart. And that was considered to be, whoa, he was the top guy. Now, I never really got it, because I could pick up my Mishnayos. Here it is, here's my Gemarah. I could pick up my Gemarah, I could look it up. Why do I need to learn it off by heart? But it's a throwback to the days when there weren't enough or any Sfarim, and the whole thing was passed down orally. So if you're going to pass down stuff orally to your pupils, and there isn't any reference book for them to refer to after you've left, it's absolutely vital that you teach them properly, and that you enunciate your words properly, and that when you say may beitzim, you explain to them that that is water of eggs, eggs that come out of chickens, so that they cannot make the mistake that you might have said may b'tzaim, marsh waters. So that's why we've answered the question now, which was, why did Rabbi Bar Chana and Rav have to go and get smicha before they went to Bavel? Why did they need that? Everybody knew that they were big Talmidei Chachamim, they were big scholars, and they had lots of knowledge. But unless they had a degree to say they know how to teach, it wasn't good enough. So the Gemarah tells us that the reason that you have to get smicha, then at least, was not just for your knowledge. Obviously, you have to be tested that you know enough, but also to ensure that the teaching that you give is clear and clearly understood by your pupils. So,
John, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Could you go over the 7 liquids that it says render food susceptible?
Yeah.
And
Okay.
water, I mean, not at a big production, but just water, dew, wine, blood, oil, milk, and honey. How does honey make, how does this happen?
How does it work? Okay. All right. I'll give you a brief explanation.
Yeah, just a brief. I don't want to waste.
Let's use, you're not wasting time because it's all good stuff. And we'll use the example of our Gemarah. You have some flour, dry flour, okay? You get your grains of wheat and you grind them up and you've got flour, okay? And then you put that flour into a bowl which is tameh. The bowl is tameh. How is the bowl tameh? The bowl is tameh because it's come into contact with a dead person. We had it in last week's Sedra. If a person if there's a dead person in a room, all the vessels which don't have a lid on it, they become tameh.
Right.
And then you have to go through a process of purifying those vessels, okay? So we have a bowl. Here we go. Here is a bowl. Actually, it's not a bowl. It's actually the light fitting which is not on, but it looks like a bowl, okay? We have a bowl, and this bowl happened to be, it's not got a lid. It happened to be in a room where there was a dead person. So this is now tameh, okay? I now take my flour and I put the flour inside that bowl, and the flour is dry. That flour does not become tameh. I can take it out of that bowl and I can do whatever I like with it, and it is not tameh. However, if I take the same flour and I mix it with one of those 7 liquids, and then I put it into this bowl, then that food, that what is now that mixture of flour and one of those liquids, which we'll call dough for the want of a better word, that dough will now become tameh. It takes the tumah from the bowl which was tameh. Okay, so the liquids are called machshirei tumah. Okay, machshirei tumah, which means they prepare or they enable tum'ah, they enable this impurity to be transmitted. Without those liquids, your dry goods will not become tameh. If I put that in there, it is not tameh. But if this was wet, if it was wet, if I'd washed it up and it was still wet on the outside, and then I put it in there, that would then become tameh.
So
now,
the essential part of these 7 liquids is the container that you put those 7 liquids into. That's the predominant way to determine whether these liquids can do that. Is that what you're saying?
Not quite. It's not that the liquid touches the bowl, it's that the liquid touches the dry goods.
In the bowl.
Doesn't have to be. So let's say we've got our flour, right, in a non-tameh bowl, in a pure bowl.
Good. Right.
We then put the liquid in, the water in, or any of these 7 things.
Right.
And we've got a dough. That dough is in a pure bowl. Okay.
Right.
So there's no tumah. If you take that dough and then put it in the tameh bowl, the dough will accept the tumah. It will become tameh because it was previously mixed with water.
Oh, I see.
Got it?
I got it.
So
thank you. Yes.
The water itself, one sec, Howard, I'll just finish this sentence. The water is an enabler, if you like. It's an enabler of tumah. The dry goods, so dry goods, it's like a catalyst, if you like, for those who are scientific.
A catalyst,
people.
yeah.
The dry goods plus an impure bowl does nothing. Dry goods plus one of the 7 liquids into the tameh bowl, then you, as it were, you get your chemical reaction and you get your tumah. Okay?
Good. Thank you. It doesn't explain it that well. You did explain it well. Thank you.
Thank you. Howard, what's your question?
I'm not a great expert on making dough, but if you were to start with the albumen and mix it with the flour in the tamay bowl, and then somebody comes along and says, well, that bowl's tamay, don't add water, use a kosher bowl, if I can put it that way, and you empty the flour and the albumen into another bowl, kosher bowl, then you can add water. It's weird.
It sounds
weird. Right.
It is weird. Wait, hang on a minute. Nobody ever said that Judaism wasn't weird.
Fine, right. That's okay, as long as we agreed. It's weird. It does seem you can do that.
Howard, if you want weird, we've talked about the para aduma. We have talked about getting a cow which is completely red, which is not allowed to have more than 2 hairs on its whole body which are not red. We're talking about slaughtering it. Okay, animals do get slaughtered. Burning it completely, taking its ashes, sprinkling those ashes in some water from a living source, mixing it all up with a piece of wood, and then getting that and sprinkling it on somebody's head on the 3rd and the 7th day. And you're talking about weird in bowls. You missed. I think you missed the trick there, Howard. The whole thing's weird.
You cast me back to Balkan's Cheder, because the only thing I can remember from there is the Red Heifer.
There you go. Okay. I don't believe that, Howard. I reckon that you can remember a lot from Balkan's Cheder, because he was a great teacher. He was a great teacher, and you're not down. And Johnny Halpin is giving us a thumbs up. He was also in that Cheder.
Sure.
I would never went to that Cheder, but he taught me how to lane. He was a great man. He was a great man. But weird it is, for sure. So, those are the halachot of tumah and liquids. Are they weird? Yes, they're weird. We don't really understand them. There are all sorts of different things that we can pull from them, all sorts of different lessons that we can learn. But the bottom line is that these are the halachot that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave. And the beauty of this is that over the 3,500 years that we've had these halachot, the beauty of it is that in every generation, somebody will have come along and learned something different from this weirdness, right? For example, I don't know if you read the Dvar Torah that I sent out on last week's Sedra that Rabbi Doe wrote and that I translated, which talks about the Para Aduma. If you didn't read it, it's worth reading. It's something completely new. I've never heard that before. This was an idea that he brought forward. And likewise, there's lots we can learn from these things. But we can't deny that they're weird.
Thank you.
Okay, it's almost time to finish. And I'm wondering whether this is a good place to, yes, I think this is a reasonable place to stop, because next time we're going to ask another question. We'll perhaps just say the first bit, but not do the question. So let's just summarize what we've said today. We finished rather unsatisfactory, at least from Rav's point of view and Julia's point of view, unsatisfactory answers as to why he wasn't allowed to give the psak on the animals. And we said that actually there's a danger if somebody is too clever, that people won't understand his psak and then make mistakes when he's not there. And then we spoke about the question of why did they have to go and get smicha in the first place? Everybody knew they were dead clever. Why did they need the title rabbi? And we said that because the smicha process was meant to not only make sure that the person had knowledge, but also they knew how to enunciate his words correctly and that he could explain things correctly because of the ma'aseh shahaya, the occurrence that took place, where this fellow came along and didn't speak clearly enough, and these poor people made an error with their dough, because they thought they were allowed to knead with marsh water, when in fact what they were told is they were allowed to knead with albumin of eggs. We also managed, as an aside, to understand, I've lost it now, understand the 7 liquids and how that works. Why those 7 liquids specifically? There will be books that have been written on why those particular 7 liquids and not other liquids, but I don't know them. So anybody that wants to look that up can do so and tell us next week. So I think we've managed to do quite a lot today. By the way, I worked out with David Marks that if we carry on at this rate of learning, Leon will be 100 years old when we finish this Masechta, because it's going to take us just about 14 and a half years. So we're hoping that Leon will live beyond 100 to 120, but I'm going to perhaps try and speed up. We should be able to speed up a bit because you now know all the Gemarah words. I don't have to keep explaining what Tana means, etc.
Leon might have mastered his iPhone by then, Johnny.
Yes,
Leon might have mastered his iPhone by then.
We hope so. We hope we'll get there before Leon's 100th birthday. But when we made good progress today, I think. So let's just set the scene then for next week's share. What we're going to talk about next week. We're over here.
Those 2 lines tell you about. Have you done those 2 lines?
We're just about to do those 2 lines now.
Well, it tells what you said already. Okay.
Yeah. No. This is what we're going to do next week. Tana. At the same time, it was. Oh no, we have. That's what we've done. That's what we've done.
Yeah.
That's what we've done. So what we're going to do next is we're going to learn a halacha, which is here. I'm just going to skip the first few lines there and go to where the inverted commas are. Talmid al yoreh halacha b'mekom rabbo. A person, a pupil of a rabbi, is not allowed to give a psak. He's not allowed to teach Torah where in a place where his own rabbi is. Okay, so if, for example, if I was to go to a certain area of Yerushalayim, I would not be allowed, according to this halacha, we'll see there are various different caveats, but on the basis of the statement so far, I would not be allowed to go to a certain area in Yerushalayim where Rabbi Brovender lives and give a shiur, because he is my Rebbe that I got smicha from, and I would not be allowed in his area, in his makom, I would not be allowed to give a shiur. But we're going to see lots of different caveats on this, and that will be the subject of the next week's shiur, which hopefully will take place at the same time next Wednesday. Before I stop recording, are there any questions about what we've learned today before I stop record? Yes, Marcel.
Something I'm slightly confused about. When we started learning this, we were learning that that it was for a korban. It was for the animal with the mum was for a korban, and then it seems like we've jumped to kasherut as different to.
You're right. We have. There is no connection, except the connection was making mistakes and why a person needed smicha. So it's one of those tangents that the Gemarah has gone off on. You're right. You're absolutely right. We were talking about bechorot, about animals, and because we were talking, let's see if we can figure out the chain. We were talking about the animals. We were talking about Rav not being allowed to give those halachot because he wasn't given permission by Rabbi. And then we said, well, why did he need permission in the first place? And they said, we need permission in the first place because of this story that happened, because this fellow went and he was talking about Tumah and Tahara, and he didn't say his words correctly. And now, since we're talking about getting smicha, now they're going to say, now you can't say halacha, you can't give a shiur in the presence of the person that gave you smicha. So it's a sort of chain of events. But you're right. There's nothing to do with the two. Are not connected.
And the other thing is that the question of the korban, that was only for learning purposes, because in Bavel there was no Beit HaMikdash to make an offering.
Not quite, because remember we're talking about the animal, a bechor, an animal which was a firstborn animal.
Yes.
It has to be taken to the Beit HaMikdash for a korban.
Yeah.
Okay. If it has a mum,
yes,
then it does not need to be taken to the Beit HaMikdash, and you can use it for yourself. If it doesn't have a mum, if it doesn't have a permanent mum, it has to be put out to graze and left until it develops a mum.
Yeah.
So it was important to know when it had a mum so you could use it for yourself. You with me?
But in Bavel, they had no, they weren't making korbanot.
You're right, but it doesn't matter. They couldn't use that animal until it developed a mum. It had to be put aside. Like today, right? When I take truma and masa from my orange tree, right? When I get my first orange of the season and I take a bit off and I say the bracha for truma and masa, in the old days, I would have found a kohen, I would have gone to Mervyn, and I would have given it to Mervyn, right? Because he's a kohen. He's no longer tahor, so I can't give it to Mervyn. So I have to put it on one side. It can't be used. So it was the same with this animal. Even though there was no Beit HaMikdash, they had to put it on one side. But there was a get-out clause. If it developed a mum, then they could use it. Okay. So it was important to know when there was a mum. Got it?
Very good.
Okay, Sharon, you wanted to ask something? You have to unmute yourself, Sharon. We can't hear you.
You're right. You're right. I was just going to tell a joke about malapropism, such as the swamp water and the egg albumin. A friend of mine spent several years here as a young woman in a kibbutz, and then came back to visit many times, but was visiting with her cousin some 60 years later. And she was talking about her memories of the frogs croaking in the swamp by the kibbutz. But this is apropos of swamp. She said the Sephardim instead of the Sfardaim, which is meaning the Sephardic people instead of the frogs. And it just shows how swamps can mix you up.
That's a very common mistake, Sephardim and Sephardim. Although, of course, and you won't get this because you're American, but the English people will get this. Of course, many of the frogs actually are Sephardim.
No, I understand. Remember, I've read Shakespeare. He loved the frogs too.
Okay, right. Let's stop recording, and then you can all